This week we're going to look at the trematodes, which includes the flukes. Flukes are found in the phylum Platyhelminthes. There's a number of them. The medically significant ones that we are going to consider include Clonorchus sinensis, Fasciola hepatica, Fasciolopsis busci, Paragonymous westermanni, Schistosoma hematobium, Schistosoma japonicum, and Schistosoma mansoni. The flukes have acetabula. That's the plural form of the word. If we're talking about one, it's an acetabulum. The acetabula of the flukes are suckers by which they attach to their hosts. The suckers are on the ventral surface of the flukes. If you recognize the word acetabulum and you remember that that's kind of the cup-like structure that the head of the femur fits into in the human hip, you're correct. It's the same word. Looked up the definition of the word, and it includes the phrase cup-like. So it's the cup-like receptor in the hip joint, and I'm guessing that the cup-like structure of that little round sucker is where this name came from. A person who has a fluke inspection, not an inspection, but a fluke infection, has dystomyiasis. Dystomyiasis is an infection with flukes. A fluke is a non-segmented, leaf-shaped, dorsal ventrally flattened worm. And we were expecting him to be a flattened worm. We remember that the phylum Platyhelminthes is all flat worms. Flukes range from a few millimeters to several centimeters in length, so consider that. Several centimeters could be an inch or more in length. As mentioned previously, they have two acetabula, one oral, one their little mouth part, and one is a little further back. We can see the ventral sucker indicated here. I believe that one is used more to really latch on to the host, whereas the oral one latches onto the host as well, but it also takes in nutrients through it. Very simple digestive tract. The oral cavity opens through the oral acetabula. The digestive tract ends in a sac. There's no anal opening. As these things age, they accumulate their own solid waste, which that's a happy little thought to consider. But by the time they die, I guess they're just full of you know what. The tegument is active. Remember, the tegument, when we're talking about worms, is their overall body surface. And by active, we mean the body surface itself absorbs nutrients, and it does get rid of some of the waste. Two types of clinically significant flukes. One type lives in the intestines and the organs that are near the intestines, including the liver and the lung. These guys are hermaphroditic. You may remember, or you maybe have not run across this word before, but the word hermaphroditic means it has male parts and female parts in one organism. The second type lives in the abdominal blood vessels. These are the blood flukes. And rather than being hermaphroditic, having a male and a female part in each one, there are male schistosomes and female schistosomes. The fluke life cycle is fairly complex, but if we start with the host, who is hosting mature flukes at this point, the mature flukes are going to produce eggs, and the eggs leave the host. In the water, something called a ciliated meracidium. It has cilia, and the term for it is a meracidium. So this ciliated meracidium emerges from the egg and enters a specific snail host. The larva develops and asexually multiplies in the snail before it leaves in mass as a structure called a cercaria. Some flukes are infected at this cercaria point. Okay, and so for example, if a human goes into water where there are cercaria in abundance, some of these things can actually penetrate the human skin. When we look at the schistosomes later on, you'll see an example of this. Other metacercaria or other cercaria form a cyst-like structure, and when they're encysted, we call them a metacercaria. And these end up sticking to vegetation, typically. And then something eats the vegetation. Could be a fish, could be a human being. So the human being might get this infection by eating vegetation that's coated with the metacercaria. Think water chestnuts, perhaps, bamboo shoots. Or if we eat a fish that has consumed this thing, and then we don't cook the fish thoroughly, that would be another way that we can pick it up. The majority of trematode infections are in Asia, where people are eating seaweed regularly, as well as other vegetation, and they're also known to consume raw or undercooked fish. So here's a real simplification of the life cycle, which is why I like it. It's nice and easy, where we have the host organism, whatever it might be, fish, bird, or mammal, releasing the eggs of the organism into the environment. And in this case, the environment is the water. In the water, these eggs mature into this form called myricidia. The myricidia are, they enter the particular mollusk, or basically snail, that they're specific for. They mature to a certain extent in the snail, and at the appropriate time, these cercaria are released. They're kind of like little tadpole-y kind of things. The tadpoles, if you will, if they're ingested by an intermediate host, which may be a fish or an invertebrate, might be a human being, these things go into the host and the cycle starts over again. And as mentioned, these things prevalent in Asia. We'll be a little bit more specific. Some species are more prevalent in Southeast Asia, some in East Asia, whatnot. But think Asia, and that'll get you in good stead for remembering where these things are. You'll want to study the notes carefully and become familiar with the various distinguishing characteristics of the trematode eggs. One thing I always appreciated about the trematodes is they're nice and big. So when you do have a patient with a trematode infection, you'll see these things. They almost jump off the microscope slide at you. They're not like looking for a little tiny trophozoite or a little tiny amoeba or whatnot. They're there, and they're quite apparent when you're looking at the slide. Clonorchis sinensis. Clonorchis sinensis, also known as the Chinese liver fluke. The adults of this organism live in the branches of the biliary tree. Diagnostically, when we find these eggs in feces, we have diagnosed the patient at that point. This is acquired by eating undercooked fish that contain the metacercariae. The eggs can also be recovered from biliary drainage using something called an enterotest capsule. They're found in the Far East, especially southern China, hence the name Chinese liver fluke. Don't you love it when they work out that way and help you remember things? One thing that is characteristic about Clonorchis is The eggs are passed intermittently. So this is one example where it's especially important to get a series of stool samples. So as we look at the diagram up here, here's the adult. You can see he's fairly sizable, centimeter in length. And here's one that's been labeled with his various parts and pieces. So we've got the oral sucker and the uterus and some other things. You can take a look at the key down here on the bottom. Here's what the eggs look like. They're operculated. The operculum's like a little cap on the end of an egg. I think they're awfully cute myself. Well, I guess you'd have to work in a micro lab and look at these things to be able to use the term cute to describe them. But anyway, they had this little pop-top lid on them. At the edges of the lid, we call this the shoulders, and it's just we're kind of elongated. Sometimes I think about it, if this was a man-made structure and this was a little pop-top lid, we'd probably have a little release button on this side, and we'd probably have a hinge on this side, and that's what it reminds me of. Sometimes you can see something called a terminal knob. It almost looks like a little terminal tail, but they're pretty hard to find. But obviously, when we use these pictures for examples, these are textbook pictures, and so everything looks marvelous and easy to identify. Moving on to Fasciola hepatica, Fasciolopsis busci. These are flukes. And if you find an egg from one of these guys, you can't tell which one it's from. They are indistinguishable. However, if we find the egg, we know it's one of these two guys, and the treatment is essentially the same. As mentioned previously, these eggs are very large. Humans are infected by eating the Metacercariae on uncooked water plants. Think water chestnuts and things like that. Fasciolopsis busci lives in the intestinal tract, prevalent in China, Southeast Asia, and India, and it's found in pigs. I'm a really visual person, and so I just can't help myself from putting in sometimes silly pictures on these things, because sometimes silly helps one remember something. So I hope they're not distracting for you, but I like visuals, I like color, whatever it takes to help me remember things. Fasciola hepatica lives in the bile duct, found in sheep raising and cattle raising countries. Uncommon in the United States, though, but the natural definitive host is the sheep. Here we're looking at Fasciola hepatica, the sheep liver fluke. Here's our reminder, this egg has a little flip top, a little operculum. This one has a little operculum that's opening up, and sometimes you can catch them where the parasite is actually coming out of the egg, which is kind of cool to see. These are unembryonated eggs, very large, 140 by 70 micrometers, and big key point here, these eggs are indistinguishable from F. busci. Fasciolopsis busci, again, large intestinal fluke. Eggs are indistinguishable from what? From F. hepatica. There have been people who have claimed that this parasite has a causal relationship with cancer. To date, there's no scientific evidence for this. I mean, it does seem intuitively like that may be correct. This causes chronic liver inflammation. So one might hypothesize that chronic inflammation might indeed lead to cancer. But again, it's not scientifically proven at this point. Paragonymous westermanni is also known as the oriental lung fluke. These adults insist in lung tissue. Eggs are passed in the sputum as well as the feces. When a person has this. Their sputum is sometimes described as bloody, and it looks like it contains rusty iron filings. Infections with Paragonymous are most common in the Far East, but also in parts of Africa and South America. The immature flukes may wander to other tissues, such as brain, skin, liver, etc. Continuing on with Mr. Paragonymous westermanni, large ovoid flukes. They're hermaphroditic. They have both testes and ovaries. And like all flukes, they have oral and ventral suckers. The eggs of Paragonymous westermanni are operculated. So here's his little cap on this end. And he's got a nice smooth thin shell, and on the other end, the opposite end from where the cap is, there's a thickened area, which is fairly typical. These eggs are similar to D. latum, but remember they can be found in sputum or stool. We're moving now from the intestinal flukes to the blood flukes. The adult blood flukes live in blood vessels. Diagnostic stage is still the egg of the organism, which would be found in feces, or in the case of one species, in the urine, although sometimes we have to do biopsy too to find the eggs. So after leaving the snail, the cercariae penetrate the skin, they lose their tail, they travel through the bloodstream to the appropriate site and develop into an adult male or an adult female. The female lives in a longitudinal groove on the male. So if we take a look up here, okay, here's our two suckers, the oral sucker, the ventral sucker. We know all flukes have those. And instead of having both male and female parts inside one body, we have a male worm, and then we have a female worm. And so not too long after they're formed, a male finds a female, or vice versa. I don't know about fluke dating, but anyway, the female enters this groove in the male, and they stay that way. And this is the way that they live within the blood vessels. And like all flukes, the intermediate host for the schistosomes are species of freshwater snail. A particular fluke species will have a particular snail species that serves as its intermediate host. Like the other flukes, we're going to diagnose the schistosome by the egg structure. The eggs are differentiated by the placement of the spine and the overall size of the egg. Initially, when a person acquires schistosomiasis, their initial symptom, actually their initial sign, would be dermatitis from where these cercariae in the water have entered straight through the skin. Once they're formed, these adult schistosomes feed on red blood cells, which of course are abundant when they're living in the blood vessels. There's a malady called swimmer's itch. And swimmer's itch, when it's caused by schistosomes, is caused by the cercariae of the schistosome entering the skin. We'll look at some pictures of that later on. Swimmer's itch due to schistosomes, non-progressive. There's the dermatitis, but doesn't seem to go anywhere from there because these are not human schistosomes generally that cause this. And here's what we end up with people with chronic schistosomiasis. These two children have hepatic schistosomiasis, so their abdomens are grossly swollen from the swelling in the vessels in and around the liver. This individual has ended up with chronic inflammation of these blood vessels, ending up, almost looks like varicose veins, this thick, ropey, protruding blood vessel enlarged from the presence of the worms and the inflammation that they're causing. This young man is holding up a container of his own urine. People who have schistosoma hematobium, this organism likes the bladder, and so one of the signs of S. hematobium infection is bloody urine. Schistosoma hematobium is the bladder fluke. These eggs are typically found in the urine. Sometimes they do show up in the feces as well. These guys are common in Africa as well as the Middle East. And there is some correlation with bladder cancer with these guys. The eggs of S. hematobium have a large terminal spine, meaning this spine-like structure sticks out of one end. And for the person who's very experienced at looking at these and comparing sizes, they will note that the typical S. hematobium egg is smaller than the typical S. mansoni egg. Here's another look at S. hematobium, or the bladder fluke, showing the terminal spine. And here's a nice shot, an unstained egg just found in the sediment, probably of a fecal specimen, but perhaps of a urine. There's an absence of a lot of other material around it, so probably it is from urine. Schistosoma japonicum is known as the Oriental blood fluke, so think of it in association with the Far East. These guys are a little smaller, and they have a small lateral spine. That arrow's pointing to it, believe it or not. Suffice it to say, they're difficult to see. These guys are a little rounder than the other schistosomes. And here's another look at this quote-unquote small lateral spine. Good luck trying to find that one in an unknown, but it's there. And you can see it if you're very lucky. Schistosoma mansoni is a fun one to find because he has this lateral spine. There's no trouble seeing that one. It's very obvious, even to a casual observer. And so once you see that guy, you know you're dealing with S. mansoni. And remember that these guys live in the blood vessels, paired up, whereby the female resides in this central canal of the male. We can use this slide to kind of summarize the geographical distribution. We said initially, think about these flukes as being in Asia. And we take a little bit further here, and now we bring in Africa, and we see that in Africa we see the urinary flukes as well as the hepatic flukes. Luckily for us, for myself anyway, over here in the West, in North America, we essentially don't see these at all. So working in the lab, the only time I've seen real schistosomes from real patients, i.e. not from a CAP survey or something, have been people who have come to this country from other parts of the world. And they're new immigrants, and generally when they get here, they very, very often have one or more parasites. Here we see a tissue section of a schistosome. These are the adult worms stained with H&E. The worms all curled up there. And as I mentioned earlier, at some point in this course, it hardly seems fair that sometimes we have to be familiar with these tissue appearances because we don't look at tissues. The histologists and the pathologists do that. But in any event, we need to be aware that this is what professionals who look at tissues for a living would see in terms of diagnosing schistosomiasis. A few slides ago, I mentioned swimmer's itch. It's a zoonosis, which pretty much goes without saying for all of these that they come from the animal world. Pick up swimmer's itch when you're swimming in water that contains the cercariae. These guys burrow right into your skin, so we end up with the skin rash, or macules and papules that are basically an allergic response to the organisms entering the skin. Because these aren't really human schistosomes, they're generally fish schistosomes or what have you. The person doesn't go on to develop schistosomiasis. The swimmer's itch is usually a fairly self-limiting situation. So now we can take a look at the CDC graphic of the life cycle of these guys. Their graphic starts down here with the eggs in the water, which open up and release the myricydia, which then penetrate whatever species of snail that schistosome species is specific for. These things replicate in the snail, and what ends up coming out of the snail are called cercariae, and the cercariae penetrate human skin. Once they're inside the human, they they lose their tails and they become this other form which enters the circulation. And as the adult worms form, males pair up with females and they go to some blood vessels somewhere, whether it's in the bladder or wherever, and they hang out and cause long-term infestation with the worms.